In the UK, we're the nationally recognised expert around community asset transfer, community asset development, community enterprises. We've worked with over 1,000 community asset transfers, local authorities and community organisations, transferring underused land and buildings into community ownership. Not just transferring the ownership, though, also transforming the asset, doing different things, creating different spaces in land and buildings to the benefit of communities. Along with our sister organisations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, we actually have about 750 members. And between them, they own 850 million, which is what, about 900 million euro in terms of the land and buildings that they own. And their focus is about creating wealth in their communities, but keeping it circulating. Instead of leaking out of the community, keeping it in the community through employing local people, working with local tradespeople, and delivering services locally. So I want to talk a little about context. And I think what I'm going to say now isn't going to be a surprise to anyone at this event about what the future holds. I think we're at the beginning of a really fundamental change in Europe. The model we've worked, certainly in the north and west of Europe, for the last 60 or 70 years has been based on the idea of an economy that's always growing. It's been based on a tax income to government that's always growing. It's been based on more and more money being put into public services. And I think that model is broken. It's not just broken for 10 years, I think it's broken for good. And as a result, there are fundamental questions being asked about the relationship between the state and the citizen, between the state and communities, about who does what, who's responsible for what, who should be doing what within our communities. And that's got major implications for local government, for central government, and for our communities. The tweet I put up there is a version of a quote from a guy called Barry Quirk, who's the chief executive of the London Borough of Lewisham. And he's one of the foremost local government thinkers in the UK. And he talks about a journey for local government, progressing from designing and delivering services, what we're all familiar with, moving towards solving problems, and then moving towards building possibility. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at things. I think it summarizes the challenges. Building possibility for local government, for national government, and indeed for communities. So I wanted to talk quickly about how that journey in the UK is panning out. Anyone here heard of big society? Yeah. In the UK, we don't talk about it anymore. And that's a shame, because there was a lot of good ideas involved in big society. The idea of communities taking responsibility, about delivering services at the lowest level, about community empowerment. But it's been used by government, central and local government, as a cover for cutting public services, and particularly to the most disadvantaged people within society. So big society has lost all credibility in the UK. Instead, we now talk about localism, backed by some legislation, the Localism Act of 2011. And included in there are a number of community rights. Community right to bid, which allows a community to list an asset of community value to stop it being sold off, or at least to allow the community to raise the money to buy it first. Community right to build, which again is about giving local people the power to talk about the sort of development they want in their community. And the community right to challenge, which allows a community organisation who thinks it can deliver services better than a local authority to have an opportunity to tender and bid for delivery. Now, there's a lot of interest in these community rights. We run the national support service for these community rights. And in 18 months, we've dealt with about 8,500 inquiries from community groups, local authorities, who want information about how to make these work. Also within the legislation is neighbourhood planning. Again, it's another aspect of allowing communities to work together democratically to decide on the sort of development they want within their community. And again, we run the National Support Service, and we're working with over 600 communities across the country. Other interesting stuff is going on. Participatory budgeting. We've just finished about a run of 12 pilots where local authorities, other public sector bodies, community organisations work together around specific issues to try and develop a coordinated approach. And so far, it's been very successful. It's improved outcomes and it's reduced costs. And as a result, the government is now looking at extending this methodology across at least another 120 local authorities over the next 15, 20 months. And at the same time, allied to these developments, we've seen a lot of changes, as we have across much of Europe, around the social finance agenda, new social investment bodies. In the UK, the government set a big society capital, £600 million of money from dormant bank accounts put to community use. We've seen a growth in the use of community shares, over 100 community share issues last year, raising about €10 million. And we're seeing the beginnings in the UK of crowdfunding initiatives, building on the success of things like Kickstarter in the United States. So these changes have opened a few doors. They have led to people thinking about co-designing services. It has encouraged local thinking and community ownership. Interestingly, the UK government is going in the opposite direction. The UK government is looking at issuing huge contracts for public service delivery, even though the ones they've issued to date have been an absolute disaster, and many of the firms involved in delivering them are being investigated for fraud and mismanagement. They're still being encouraged to bid for new contracts. But one of the interesting debates that's coming out at the moment is about contract size, actually about diseconomies of scale. There's this idea that economies of scale is some sort of economic law, that doing it bigger derives savings. That's true if you're making pins in a factory. It's not true when you're delivering public services to people in communities. And there's a lot of evidence that small-scale local contracts delivered by people who understand their community are more efficient, more effective, deliver better outcomes, and deliver better value for money. Another bit of legislation that fits into this equation is something called the Social Value Act. And that allows local authorities and other bodies, when they're putting out contracts to tender, not just to focus on cost, but also to look at some of the wider issues around benefits to communities. So that sounds positive. There's a few examples here of projects that have utilised community rights. The one at the top is Hastings Pier. Hastings is a seaside town, the south of England. This pier was owned by a shadowy offshore company. It was falling apart. In fact, there was a big fire there. The community forced the local authority to buy it and then pass it into community ownership. And they've raised £13.4 million, about 14.5, 15 million euro, to refurbish it, to turn it into a hub for enterprise, for tourism, and it's formed the platform for a whole range of other community enterprise activities in the town. This picture is FC United of Manchester, a split from Manchester United Football Club of genuine supporters. They've set up their own football club. They've raised £3.5 million to build their own football ground and community facilities. And at least half of that money has been raised through their supporters, through community share issues. And this one is a pub in South London, which is going to be sold off. And again, it's really important to the community. And very quickly they mobilised, and they raised enough money through community shares to buy it. So this pub is now owned by the local community. Now that sounds quite impressive. Has big society worked? Has localism worked? First of all, there's a real downside to big society. Not all communities are equal. Not all communities have got the same resources, the same access to capital, the same skills, the same expertise to be able to make these things happen. And there's a real danger with big society and localism that it's the most disadvantaged communities that actually get left further behind. Similarly, you have to ask, Would these things have happened anyway? Is this new? Has localism really unleashed a new way of community activism? And I think the answer is no. Hastings Pier would have happened anyway. FC United of Manchester would have happened anyway. I want to talk about a couple of our members as examples. Coin Street Community Builders own an area of about 55,000 square metres on the south bank of London. If you know London, you look from Parliament, you've got the London Eye on the other side. Everything to the left of that is owned by a community organisation. They have 4 housing co-ops with 320 housing units. They have a neighbourhood childcare centre, a neighbourhood centre. They run their own bus service for residents. They do arts and cultural events. They've got planning permission to build an Olympic-sized swimming pool, a new headquarters for the Ballet Rambert dance company, and a 40-storey block of flats accommodation. That's a community organisation with that sort of ambition. And they have a turnover at the moment of about 10 to 12 million euro, a community organisation. Started small, but grew. Goodwin Development Trust is in a town called Hull on the east of England, back end of nowhere. It's based on an estate of 5,000 people, one of the most deprived states in Britain. The board of governance, the governors for this organisation, every one of them comes off that estate. No lawyers, no accountants, local residents. It has a turnover, again, 10 to 12 million euro. It owns 16 buildings. They rent space to the local authority and the health service, not the other way around. They rent space to the local authority. They're the biggest employer in the city after the public sector. They employ over 300 people. And what I love about them is their ambition. They tried to buy the Humber Bridge, which was, when it was built, was the biggest suspension bridge in the world. It crosses a big estuary, a big river called the Humber. They tried to buy it for £100 million. That was a step too far for government. But they're asking questions about who owns infrastructure, about community ownership of infrastructure. And recently, they're developing a project called the Oxypod, a very simple little device that cuts central heating bills by 30%. The only case they tested where it didn't, it reduced costs by 7%, and when they looked at it, it was because it had been fitted upside down, but still reduced costs by 7%. And they're going to be marketing that with a consortia of other community organisations in the north of England. And that, for me, is building possibility. That shows what can be done if the creative commitment and knowledge and ideas in a community is unleashed. So am I optimistic? Cautiously. I said before, I think we're in a period of transformative change, structural change. But also, importantly, I think we're in a period of technological change. The spread of networks, the global infrastructure for information, which leads to the potential for sharing. Also, I think there's a change in terms of culture and values, with an increasing interest in new forms and expressions of the democratic voice through participatory budgeting, through crowdsourcing, about people wanting a say in their communities. Wanting more than just putting a cross on a bit of paper every 5 years. So I'll just come to an end by saying I think it's the beginning of the beginning. I want change. Change is not coming, though, from big government, which doesn't have the money or the legitimacy. Legislation doesn't make things happen. People do. I think the future lies at the neighbourhood level as the building block for doing things differently. Because neighbourhoods now can talk to other neighbourhoods, not just neighbourhoods next door, but neighbourhoods on the other side of a city, on the other side of a country, on the other side of Europe, and on the other side of the world. So I'll just end by saying I think the mark of a 21st century person is somebody who bravely steps forward with one foot, but keeps the other foot rooted in their community. Because even as our intellectual and economic horizons expand, the neighbourhood is still where people live their lives. And neighbourhoods might seem small in the big scheme of things, but I think it's a mistake to underestimate the potential of neighbourhoods to change the world one neighbourhood at a time, because that's already happening. across the world. There are examples to see.